Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace that test. A full textbook, tons of questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off. Now, let's get started. Today, we've got Jeremy Tate from the CLT joining us. Jeremy, really excited to have you on the show, and I would love if you could introduce yourself for the audience.
Yeah, hey Tyler, thrilled to be here. About 10 years ago, I was running an SAT, ACT prep company as well before starting a competitor to the SAT and ACT.
Mm-hmm.
And big fan. It's great to be chatting with you today.
Yeah, thank you. So you are the CEO of CLT. So tell me, right, there was already, as you were well aware, being a tutor for that, the SAT and the ACT. So what got you thinking that there needed to be something else?
Yeah. It was a number of things came together at once. You know, if you think back to 2014, 2015, during this time, the Common Core standards were kind of all the rage. There was a lot of excitement, a lot of public funds, federal funds tied to Common Core adoption. So kind of went through the states. David Coleman, as you may recall, he was kind of the chief architect behind the Common Core standards. And David Coleman then went over to the College Board. And what he did immediately was to announce that the SAT was going to be aligned to the Common Core standards. Now, the ACT had already made this move. And if you know anything about the history of the SAT, this is very odd because for generations, the SAT had said, you can't study for this test. This is an aptitude test. This measures cognitive ability. And then they started kind of changing that, really. So they really started changing this in about 2005. And with the launch of the new SAT in 2016, David Coleman said they removed every last trace of aptitude testing. So if you're not aptitude testing anymore, well, what are you doing? You're achievement testing. And achievement testing has to be built around particular academic standards. And in this case, it's the Common Core. So in other words, the SAT went from an aptitude test to a Common Core public school mastery test. And so if you're coming from a homeschool or a classical school or a charter school that's not doing Common Core math, it's starting to look increasingly disconnected and increasingly weird. But Tyler, there was another component here as well, and this was probably the more important component, is that these tests, they're not just evaluative tools. Tests are also pedagogical tools. Tests teach. And so we wanted to have a test that was built around the most important ideas that have been the most powerful in driving the history of thought and culture over the past 2 millennia. And so on the CLT, students are not just reading, processing Greek yogurt. They're reading something from Aristotle's Republic. They may be reading something from St. Augustine's City of God. These works that have been the most important in shaping 2,000 years or more of history.
Yeah, and so tell me a bit more about that too, right? Basically, the one of the key distinctions about the CLT and its differentiation from the SAT and ACT is its focus on this classic text, right? So to you first, I guess let's start out by saying, what do you define as classic text?
That's a great question. So we really don't put any. I think there's a couple of exceptions, but generally our rule is that you've got to be dead for at least 50 years, right? You don't really know if something is classic or not until it can prove that it can stand the test of time. Does this text have the ability to speak into the lives of people across time, place, and cultures, right? That's what makes a classic, is that it touches on something so profound in the human experience that it doesn't matter where you put it, right? You take the Odyssey, you take it, have African tribal people read it. You can take it and you can have, people living in Manhattan today read it, right? And it touches upon something profoundly human that all of us can relate to. That's what makes a classic a classic. And so those are the kinds of texts we want to put in front of our students.
Right. And so was the purpose of that to was the purpose because it was more closely aligned with homeschool and other types of school curriculums that are not Common Core? Or is it more related to the fact that basically, you are very passionate about this type of literature and learning.
Yeah, I love that question. I think about our academic board president. We've got a big academic board at CLT. 70 people are so on this board, but our board president, Dr. Angel Adams Parham, she is a Yale graduate. She's a professor at the University of Virginia, top academic. I remember her saying to me, I realized, Germany, that I wasn't really well educated until I started homeschooling my own children. Right? This is the
Hmm.
author as well of the Black intellectual tradition. And she said, I'd never really read Homer. I'd never read Dante. I'd never read St. Augustine.
Hmm.
So in no other generation could you make an argument that you're an educated person had you not read deeply from these luminaries, right?
Right.
And so we want to say, what is going on? We need to get back to what it means to be an educated person is that you are participating in a conversation, in the great conversation
Hmm.
that transcends our own moment in time and that puts us in contact with generations before us.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I am curious. I mean, as we're thinking about like the CLT and its differentiation from the SAT and ACT, certainly the literature that you guys focus on is a big piece of it. I feel like the next big piece of it, though, is the way that you do your math section. Like, I think
Yep.
that the quantitative reasoning section is really distinct because it doesn't focus so much on, let's say, computation, right? Like, what's 4 times 12? And it focuses a lot more on logical reasoning and problem solving. Or at least that's what
Yeah.
I've heard. I'd love if you could kind of explain that and flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. On the math side, it's funny. We've had some of the top, people like yourself, top SAT, ACT people in the country take a look at the CLT math and they say things like, oh, this is like SAT math from the 90s. And we're like,
Right.
yeah, kind of,
Or
right?
GMAT
And that's
today,
part
but
of,
obviously at a high
yeah.
school level.
Yeah, and that's part of the name, right? Is a classic learning test, not the classical learning test, classic. And what we mean by that is we're testing the things that we used to all be interested in, that we used to all be
Mhm.
testing as well, right? And so, some people would say it's not fair to have a test that measures cognitive ability, which is what an aptitude test does, which is what CLT, you can prep to some degree, of course, for CLT quantitative reasoning section. And we do have main components, of algebra 1, algebra 2, geometry, trigonometry. But we also have, like you said, logical reasoning ability being measured as well.
Mhm.
And we try to respond to this critique of, you can't have a test that's measuring aptitude. That's not fair. That's just what kids are born with. We would say, well, it's also not fair to have a test that is prescriptive on curriculum, to say that
Mhm.
everybody's got to go and do Common Core math, right?
Mhm.
When that's not the way anybody was doing math until about 10 years ago.
Right. Well, and it's not only that, it's that um, what is the Common Core can very well change from administration to administration, right? And so
Yeah.
to a certain extent, I think that is part of the reason why these sort of alternative schooling options are becoming more popular. And it also makes sense that these school options need, or would prefer a different type of assessment, one that's not basically a Common Core like
Yeah.
checkbox test, right? Which is what you're kind of not arguing, but kind of what you're alluding to.
Yeah, and we really want to try to reset, SAT and ACT, for 50 years, if not since 1959 when the ACT launched. This is
Hmm.
the context of Sputnik and the space race and this fear that we were behind the Soviets in math and science. Um, really since these tests have both gone mainstream, though, in some ways they've been in this market dynamic where there's a market incentive to race to the bottom, right?
Hmm.
Because that means they're going to be the easier pathway to scholarships and to admissions to select colleges. And so to have your test be a little bit easier than your competitors is a market advantage. And
Right.
so we believe that the SAT and ACT have been dumbing down precisely for the reason of competing against each other. They've been dumbing it down. And this is why, we have seen where other tests have decreased over time, the
Mhm.
SAT scores continue to go up, right? And it's because it's this inflation. We hear a lot about grade inflation. Test inflation is just as bad, if not worse. I remember in the late 90s when I took the SAT, we're only about a dozen kids a year, who got a
Mhm.
perfect 1,600. Now it's about 1,500 kids a year. So if you're applying to Harvard or Yale, it's just not that special. If you've got, an 800 on verbal or, 1560, combined score. So we're trying to hit the reset button and say, look,
Mhm.
if you get a 116 or a 118 or a 120 on the CLT, this means what it used to mean, to
Mhm.
get a perfect score in the SAT 20 years ago.
Right. Well, and I think that also kind of that leads to the question of like what kind of student does well on the CLT, right? Like who is the CLT for? Or if you're a parent, you know, I assume that it's not, just 100% parents of homeschooled children that take this test. I think that's branching out into lots more audiences than that. So who do you feel like is the student that will really thrive in this test?
Yeah, we can't believe the way this has happened over the past year. I mean, we have grown, just test takers from about 35,000 in 2023 to this year should be about 350,000.
Holy
And
cow.
uh, and so yeah, so 12x ish growth. It's been absolutely bananas. We've actually been capping the number of tests. I think part of what is going on is that the SAT and ACT are painfully boring assessments.
Yeah.
I mean, they really are. And I've met with people from the College Board and ACT who've been part of their sensitivity committees and a sensitivity committee. And look, this isn't a terrible idea. I get it, right? Like, when this first started off, the idea was, hey, if a student had something horrific happen in their family, maybe their uncle committed suicide. We
Hmm.
wouldn't want to have a reading passages that references suicide. That would be distressing, triggering, upsetting to the student. We
Of
wouldn't even get
course.
an accurate score. So I get that. That makes sense. But they've gone in this really crazy direction where everything, as this has been relayed to me, can be said to be offensive to somebody. So
Hmm.
then what you end up with is the most painfully boring passages on the most important test, right? As one of the ways a student put it to me, she said, you would never ever read what's on the SAT unless you're taking the SAT.
Right.
She said, with the CLT, you know that you kind of should be reading these passages and these texts anyway, right?
Hmm.
And so I love that we get to take this time that is, it seems to be a waste. It seems to be you're just learning these tricks to say, no, you can get immersed into a beautiful, timeless, meaningful tradition that for many kids, they start prepping for CLT and they go and major in philosophy.
Hmm.
They start prepping for CLT, they major in classical literature. And so we're really loving the way that the CLT can kind of serve as a beachhead to introduce kids to this amazing tradition that they've often never been exposed to.
Right. Well, and I mean, I don't have children yet. Knock on wood, that's the plan. But my thought about it, right, is if you looked, call it, say, 5, 10 years ago, pretty much everybody was telling their kids to go into computer science. Now there's a huge, dearth of computer science entry level jobs, and new graduates are having a tough time with it. And
Yep.
like computer science is a tough skill, right? I think that at the end of the day, the one of the best ways to kind of future proof, quote unquote, your child's education is to teach them how to think. And
Hmm.
that's something
Totally.
that you would get as a part of this that, with the SAT and ACT, maybe not quite so much is what you're saying.
Yeah. I think this conversation with Mark Cuban, owner of the Dallas Mavericks,
Right.
Shark Tank. Everybody knows Shark Tank. I like Shark Tank. My kids love Shark Tank. Um, and he said in 10 years, he probably said this 5 years ago now, 10 years, liberal arts majors are going to be more valuable than computer science majors. And people thought he was crazy at the time. But now that we're seeing more and more automation, the ability to step back and to think well about big picture,
Mhm.
quickly moving markets, this kind of thing. I think these students are going to be uniquely equipped to navigate this kind of economy. But that's never the purpose, of a liberal arts or a humanities focused education. The purpose is always becoming more human.
Mhm.
I think of Cornel West, who's now running for president. We've actually done a couple of op-eds together, one in the Washington Post and one in the Wall Street Journal. And the way that Dr. West describes the purpose of education is that it's a deep dive into what it means to be fully human. And if you think about what a rich definition that is of what education is, and you compare that to just like the soul crushing experience that so many kids have of school, it's a really really sad thought, and nobody would expect a test to be something that could wake people up to something richer, but we really do hope that we can do that for some students.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, clearly you've seen a lot of growth from this philosophy, and I think that is a great sign of traction, right? I mean, 300,000 people is now starting to get you into the ballpark of SAT and ACT, which are kind of like 1.5 million per. And I'm
Yeah.
curious, like, what do you feel like is driving that growth? Do you think that it's sort of alignment with a with people that have been waiting for something like this, or other major macro changes? Like, I know that Florida accepts it for their Bright Future scholarship now, for instance. I believe. What do you feel like are the key drivers for this?
Yeah, Florida's been a huge part of this story for sure. And so this was about a year and a half ago, I guess now that Governor DeSantis and we try to kind of stay above the political fray at CLT.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that I would do
we
the
had
same. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, but you've got a guy running for president, and he's kind of picking a fight with the college board, and at one time, saying we're gonna kick the college board out of the state of Florida and find somebody to replace you, and we that did not happen. But what they did do is they put CLT in Florida as an equal, and they
Mhm.
tied it to what's called Bright Futures. And so now you get a 96 on the CLT. You can go to Florida State for free, tuition free, still
Wow.
paying room and board. Go to the University of Florida for free. 96 on the CLT. It's incredible. So tons of students in Florida have been taking it as well. But now we're going to be in legislation in 5 or 10 other states as well. And in some ways, this is just a very it's a very sleepy arena, right? This is a very sleepy industry. SAT and ACT, um, and they've only had each other for the past 60 or so years to
Mhm.
kind of compete, and and so I feel like it's really kind of primed for disruption. And
Mhm.
they don't. Neither one of them seems to be passionate about any particular vision for education or very clear about what education even is. Right? They talk a lot about college and career readiness, but I think that's a pretty impoverished vision for education. I think students are hungry for something much richer than that, and they've been deprived of it in a lot of ways. And
Mhm.
so it's wonderful. I mean, we've got kids right now, public school kids, looking to get into Florida State, but on the way there, they're taking this test where they're reading passages from Dante's Inferno. They're reading passages, from Aristotle's Politics, and so that is really cool. And again, it's reshaping what they're thinking about for majors as well, which is just so fun.
Yeah. Very cool. And also that is a nice segue into kind of another question, which is what are the colleges that are accepting it today, right? I feel like, on that list is probably growing similarly quickly if your list of students is growing so much as well.
Yeah, yeah. So besides, the University of Florida system, Florida State University of Florida, there's about 350 or so other colleges. Now, most of these are colleges that are private, often Christian, Catholic, liberal arts colleges. So places like Hillsdale College, Benedictine, University of Dallas, Christendom, Grove City, these kind of schools. But I do think we're going to be getting significant adoption within the public university arena in the next year or two
Mhm.
as we start to make inroads on the legislative front in more and more states.
Yeah, and what do you feel like the administrators, um, I guess the people that like work for, the state of Florida university system as an example, like what excites them about this test?
Yeah, I think one is partly that we have seen the College Board go increasingly ideological. that's part of the reason that this has happened in Florida. And I don't think that they're wrong. Actually, I think the College Board has gotten increasingly ideological. In fact, there was a question that this is interesting, right? So this is from an AP Human Geography test, and this is about a year and a half ago. And a high school girl takes a picture of her test and she puts it on Instagram and Twitter and a number of other social platforms, and it really blows up. And the question said this: it gave students a table with birth rates and death rates, and it said which country has made the most advances based on the table. Which country has made the most advances in female empowerment? And all they had were the birth rates and the death rates. And the correct answer was the country that had dropped the most in their birth rate, right? And so they're equating female empowerment with not having babies, right? Which I think for a lot of women, many powerful women, right, with big families, that's insulting. It's ideological. It's an opinion. It's fine. They're entitled to their opinion, but that they're presenting that as some kind of an objective fact, when really it's just a pretty new philosophy. Is all that it is, right? I mean, Queen Victoria had 6 kids, right? A lot of the most powerful women in history had many, many, many children, and so I think projecting that kind of ideology, but trying to do it through you've got to answer our way, you got to agree with us ideologically to get the question right, it is really toxic. And I think that's why DeSantis and the administration down there are looking for a test that transcends kind of ideology like that and can be, testing kids. And that's one of the advantages of having a test that's rooted in the classics, right? Is that we can avoid the hot button issues that ACT and SAT keep stepping into.
Well, right. And I mean, at the end of the day, regardless of your political stance, Plato is Plato. And it's been around from way before any of these politics existed. I mean, it is also worth
Yeah.
noting though, and I think, this is a key thing also for your guys' adoption in the longer term, is that, you are just because of, the people who like the CLT does not make the CLT a politically affiliated test.
Yep. Yeah. I really appreciate you saying that, and I mean, it's so funny. You know, I mean, Adolf Hitler loved good infrastructure. He was into good roads and bridges. That doesn't mean you're a Nazi if you like good roads and bridges, right? And we had people like literally making the equation like, oh, this is a right wing test because Ron DeSantis likes it. Well, that doesn't follow at all, right? I think a lot of people like a lot of things that you can like apart from any kind of like ideological agreement. A lot of people like the CLT just because it's more academically rigorous, because we're doing the old math like they used to like it on the SAT.
Hmm.
That we've retained aptitude testing as well. So I think that's a really, really key. And we've got, look, Cornel West, he's running for president. He's a good buddy. He's on our board. And I talked to him just last week. And I think what's interesting about somebody like Cornell is, and he runs around with Robbie George, and they're good friends, and Robbie's also on our board. But these guys have a vision for education that transcends contemporary partisan politics. And so much of America right now, we can't even think outside of these kind of partisan lenses to even begin to consider
Hmm.
that there are some things that do transcend politics. And I believe that's what America's founding generation. I mean, one of the things they didn't argue about was what was a good education, right?
Hmm.
They all kind of read from the same canon. They all had a pretty similar reading list, and it gave them a common ground to have these really, really heated debates.
Hmm. Yeah, well, and I think at the end of the day, um, it really, I really like understand and appreciate your point of view that essentially you should have a test that's not necessarily about like sort of regurgitating what you learned in school, because I think what is going to be quote unquote learned in school is probably going to change and could potentially even start to become pretty different on like a state by state basis. For instance, I just feel like a test that's a bit removed from that common core is going to be good for everybody, right?
I think so, and to us, it's a very basic question. I mean, what are we testing at CLT? Well, we're testing your ability to read and engage with the very best of what has been thought and said, with the kinds of texts that have been the most instrumental in driving the development of history and culture over 2,000 years. We're testing your ability to reason well and to do some basic math, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think that is what this return to reading, writing, arithmetic. I think is something a lot of Americans are hungry for, and I think it's one of the reasons we found a lot of success so far.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, so anything else about the CLT that I haven't asked you yet, or that you are looking to talk about? Like, anything that, any questions that you feel like I've missed?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the conversation, and I think we're expecting adoption, kind of like in Florida from several other states this year, and we certainly want to point people in your direction as
Hmm.
more and more people are calling us, inquiring about test prep. Where do we look? So, Tyler, I appreciate the conversation, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. I really appreciate you being on the show. And this has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world with Jeremy Tate from the CLT. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT course by going to achievable.me. And if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off.